Hi everyone, welcome to GCSE Paper 2. This is the second GCSE paper this year. We're going to have a look at a preview of what might come up on this year's paper and how to tackle it. So this is what we're going to do in this video. We're going to go through an exam intro. We're going to look at some exam questions from previous years, calculation from previous years. I'm going to do a bit more depth on some of the calculations. I'm going to go through like those calculations, for example, with a bit more detail. We're going to then have a look at some key terminology that I think is quite key to know. And then we'll do a little bit of a recap on some exam technique basics and some final tips. So in the description, I'll put down some little chapters for each of these so you can have a look at certain parts of the video. The structure from the two papers is the same in terms of section A, B, and C. So section A will again be 35 marks, 29 which will be short answer questions. Section B will still be 30, section C will still be 25. Remember our short answer questions 1, 2, and 3 markers, long answer questions 6, 9, and 12 markers. The key is trying to maximize the short answer questions as much as possible. If you look at how many marks there are available in short answer questions, obviously you can get a decent grade by just doing those. If you get those spot on, it can make a massive difference to your grade. So focus on maximizing those, but not wasting too much time on them. So in terms of types of questions, section A will have some multiple choice questions. There'll be some 2-mark multiple choice questions as well. There'll be a couple of calculation questions. About, I think it's 6 explain 1 questions, the 3-mark BLT questions, and then 1 discuss question. Section B will have a 9-marker and 2 6-markers. The 6-markers in the section B are a bit different from section A because they require the case study. 9-markers, obviously, there's a 9-marker in section B and section C. And then the rest will be made up of a couple of calculation questions and a couple of 1 and 2 markers that require the case study. Section C will have 1 2-marker, 2 1-markers, and one of those will come from a graph, and then a 9-marker and a 12-marker. So make sure you know what to expect in each section. Of course you should, because you've done paper 1, so you should have an idea. You should have plenty of experience of this already. Right, let's have a look at the essays that have come up over the last few years. Now, the key thing with paper 2 is, I thought the case studies in paper 1 were okay actually. Last year they were a bit more tricky because there were types of businesses that young, like 16-year-olds wouldn't have had much experience with, if any. This year they're a bit more straightforward. With paper 2, you're more likely to see a business that you'll know, like an actual business that you'll have heard of. It's no guarantee, of course, but over the last few years we've had a lot of businesses that students would recognise, and so maybe you should expect that. But that is countered by the fact that the key terminology is much more specific in theme 2, and so there's a lot more key term you have to be aware of. So looking at through some of these, you've got a couple of ethics questions. We've had a few. We've had a question on logistics. We've had a question on takeovers, a question on flexible remote working for 12 markers. The 9 markers, there's been a few bits about like different sources of finance, permanent v temporary contracts, share capital v loan capital, online advertising versus sponsorship. So there's been quite a few like specific key terms in there. Whereas I think in paper 1 you sometimes get a bit more general 9 markers. And then 6 markers, we've had permanent employees, downsizing the workforce, changing objectives. We've had public limited companies, customer service and suppliers, just-in-time stock control, flow production, globalization, retained profit, technology logistics, tariffs, customer service, and new technology and warehouses. So we're going to talk about some key terms a little bit later on. But as you can see, you need to have a better key term understanding for paper 2 than you did for paper 1. Luckily, I've got loads of resources for that you can use to help. Right, in terms of calculations, the calculations are a bit more broad as well. Average rate of returns come up a couple of times. We've seen a few cost of sales and gross profit and profit margins. We've seen quite a few stock control information. So those are the kinds of things we're looking at. Again, as I said, I'm going to go through those in a bit more depth. So let's have a look at theme 2 calculations. The first is average rate of return. So average rate of return assesses, with an investment project, how much of the investment cost does the business make as average yearly profit? Now, this also comes up in the A level, and in the A level, you have to calculate the average yearly profit yourself. It's a bit more complicated. But what I've seen so far in the GCSE is that the tables are quite generous. They pretty much give you the 2 pieces of information you need: average yearly profit and investment cost. And the challenge is memorizing the formula. So average yearly profit divided by investment cost times by 100 means that you've got a percentage. So in this case, if the investment cost £400,000 and the average yearly profit was £100,000, then that would be 25%. What this basically means is, for the project that costs £400,000 every year they get 25% of that initial cost as profit. So £100,000 is profit each year. That's worth 25% of the initial investment cost. So the higher this is, the better. The higher this is, the more profitable the project is. We've also got this little mini table, and you won't necessarily get all of this table, but just like for this example, we've got revenue, cost of sales, gross profit, operating profit, and interest, and net profit. Let's talk through what these mean. Revenue is the amount of money that the business has generated over the course of probably more likely a year, but it could be over any period of time really, but it's mostly a year. In terms of the money they've generated from sales. So this business has generated £500,000 in sales. The cost of sales are like the direct manufacturing costs for the product. Like, so for example, materials, packaging, they're basically like the variable costs. And so to make the products that have been sold for £500,000, they've spent £200,000 on the materials. And then what that allows you to do is work out the gross profit. So gross profit is revenue minus cost of sales. So in this situation, 500,000 minus 200,000. Then we have our operating expenses and interest. So these would be like our fixed costs, perhaps. So like this could be rent, this could be utilities, all of those different things, salaries and what have you, and any interest that they pay on any bank loans. This is £150,000. So if we subtract that from our gross profit, we'll get our net profit. So £300,000 for gross profit, and then £150,000 for net profit. So that's the first thing you need to be aware of. How do you calculate gross profit and net profit? You need to know those two formulas. The next two formulas seem like they're more complicated, but are actually more straightforward because it's the same formula for both, and you just swap the word gross for net. So gross profit margin is gross profit over revenue times 100. Net profit margin is net profit over revenue times 100. So you can, you're more than welcome to pause this video and give those a try quickly, and you can get an answer. And if you unpause, I'll go through it and talk through what those numbers mean. So gross profit is 300 over 500 times by 100 is 60%. Net profit is 150 over 500 times by 100 is 30%. What do these mean? Gross profit, to be honest, if you get this as a 2-mark calculation question, it doesn't matter what it means, but I want to make sure you're aware of it anyway. Gross profit is 300,000, revenue is 500,000, so the gross profit margin is what percentage of the revenue was gross profit. So after we just paid off our variable costs, our cost of sales, what percentage of our revenue did we keep? So we kept 60% after we just paid off our cost of sales. The net profit is after we've paid off all of our costs. So this is 30%, which means that we have kept 30% of our revenue after taking away all those costs. With both of those figures, the higher the better. But it will depend on the business. Like some businesses, if they've got very low variable costs, their gross profit margin could be really high. Like a gym, for example, where most of their costs are overheads, fixed overheads, you would probably expect their gross profit margin to be in the 90%. Other businesses with really high costs to make the products might make quite a low gross profit margin, but they might sell a huge quantity and therefore make their profit that way. The last bit that you've got to be aware of for theme 2, calculation-wise, like in terms of like big models, obviously there'll be potential for percentage change and things like that. But the main big model is the Bargate stock graph. So let's go through this step by step. So I'm going to show you a purple line that shows how stock changes over time. But before we do that, let's have a look at the maximum stock level. So this maximum stock level here is at 75. So that might be just the maximum that they're able to hold because of their storage space, or just how much they're willing to hold of a certain product. So our stock level goes up to 100 here, but their maximum for their business is going to be at 75. So this purple line shows that over time, over a period of days or weeks, we'll say weeks. We could say days. It doesn't really matter really. I haven't set anything for it. Their stock depletes. So over a course of days, you can see that over the course of 4 days, they go from 75 to 25. And then obviously what they will do is they will reach this reorder level, and then they will place a new order. So the reorder level is at 50. So the idea here is that when they reach 50 units, they will place another order of stock. It takes a little bit of time for that to be delivered. So what we'll see here is this bit in blue is the lead time. So that lead time is the difference between when they order the stock, the new stock to arrive, and when it actually arrives. You can see that on 4 days, after 4 days, so that's 2 days after the order was placed, they have received their delivery and their stock then goes back up to 75. Now, what you'll see there at the bottom is we've got this new line called the buffer stock level. So this is the minimum level that we want to keep. Clearly, the business doesn't want to go into that level, below that level. That might just be their backup in case they have an exceptionally high level of demand. But generally speaking, they're trying to make sure they can always please their customers. They've always got some, so they kind of keep it at that rate. Now, ideally, we get that new stock before we reach our minimum stock level, because that means we've got that buffer stock in case new stock is delayed, for example, or there's a big rush in demand. So over time, what you would see is it just kind of follows that pattern. So you'd see, for example, we receive new stock after 4 days, so we're back up to 75. And then when we get to day 6 and we get to 50, we will place a new order for stock. And then 2 days later on day 8, that will arrive and push us back up to 75. And that just continues and continues like that. Now, the key thing with this is obviously mine's quite neat and tidy because I'm just trying to show you the model. The ones you get in the exam might be a little bit different. So you might be asked to have a look at things like, for example, what was the maximum stock level? So you would look at like the top level. What was the buffer stock level? You might be looking to try and work out the lead time. So you just look at when the reorder was placed and then how long it took for the new stock to arrive. You might be asked to calculate how much stock had been delivered. So you just look at, like, for example, on day 4, we went from 25 to 75. So you can work out how much stock was delivered. Obviously, it was 50 on that day. Those would be the kinds of things you'd have to do. I think if you understand the graph, they're really, really easy marks. So make sure you know your way around this graph. Okay, key terminology in theme 2. I've got some links in the description for this for theme 2 revision videos, which go through a lot of these key terms, of course, and a key term Quizlet on with all of theme 2 key terms in there. I've put, this is not the entire key term list, obviously, there's a lot more than this, but I've put like the specific ones. I've put the ones that maybe you wouldn't necessarily recognize as kind of common English language. And there's a whole bunch on here. My big bit of advice would be, and this is something I've done with my students where I've got them to print this out and go through it, but I would stop and go through as many of these as you can and just make sure you know all these key terms. And if you don't, do some research, watch the revision videos on them. I've put a little note as to what topic they come from, so 2.1.1, 2.1.2, etc. But I've just put the key, like, specific key terms in here. There obviously are more. I am going to pick on the ones that are highlighted, though. Just not because I think they're necessarily going to come up, because, look, there's loads of questions. Most things are going to come up. But just because they're specific and I think they're worth just a little bit of extra support with. So the design mix is the way in which a business prioritizes certain features or design priorities when designing a product. So you've got 3 sections to the design mix. You've got aesthetics, function, and economic manufacture. Aesthetics is what it looks like, what it smells like, what it tastes like, depending on what kind of product it is. If it's a chocolate bar, it's about taste. If it's a car, it might be about the way it looks. If it's an item of clothing, it'll be about how it looks or how it feels. Function is about what it does and whether it works and how it works effectively. And economic cost is about how much it costs to manufacture the product. Different businesses will prioritize these in different ways. So Aldi, for example, will be prioritizing their economic cost because they need to keep costs low so they can have low selling prices. Whereas like a Ferrari, of course, look, the Ferrari needs to be able to drive, otherwise it's kind of pointless. But the main priority for a Ferrari is probably going to be the way it looks, because that's what's going to make people buy that car compared to buying a Ford or an Aston Martin or anything like that. In terms of 2.3, 2.3's got quite a few key terms, so I've highlighted quite a bit in here because I think it's probably one of the hardest bits. In terms of production methods, you just need to know the difference between job, batch, and flow and when they would be used. Job production is where it's one-off production of individual items. So this is quite good for customization, for personalizing to meet customer needs, but it can be quite expensive and time-consuming to create because you're probably going to need a highly skilled worker and you're probably going to have to train them quite highly. And so it also is a bit slower. So you're probably going to have a little bit of a higher selling price, but that's probably because of all those factors I've just mentioned. Batch is where you make identical products in a batch. So you think about when you go to Greggs and they make sausage rolls. So I've got a student who works in Greggs and they told me that basically when they get to the last tray of sausage rolls, that's when they'll make the next batch. So even if they know they're going to sell 120 in a day, you're not going to make 120 at the start because, well, first of all, no one likes a cold sausage roll. So you're not going to want to buy the ones that were made 6 hours ago. But also there's the risk there that with that if you don't use batches, you might just have too many and you might end up throwing loads away. I imagine they do throw some away, but the fact that they do batches limits that. So great for certain products. Some products will be a little bit of batch and a little bit of job. So if you take, for example, like a wedding cake, they might make the actual kind of like sponge for the cake in batches, and then they might customize them for each individual person using job. So sometimes it can be a bit of both. Flow production is for continuous production. So this is where a business has really high levels of demand and they just want to produce it 24/7. So it's quite heavily machine based, so capital intensive, whereas job production is usually a bit more labor intensive, meaning made by people. So flow production, for example, like Heinz beans, that would be a great example because the products are always in demand, high demand, so they just have them running off the machines all the time. Chocolate bars would be another example of that. If you've watched a video about like what a factory looks like, it's probably a bit of flow production. Productivity and efficiency is a really key term to know the difference between. Productivity is about the quantity that you produce. Efficiency is about making the best use of your resources. So I always use the same example. I always use the example, which is the one I use in the revision video, of two basketball players. So if you've got one who makes 6 out of 10 shots, and then you've got another who makes 5 out of 7, well, the one who's been more productive is the one who made 6 out of 10 because they've made 6 shots instead of 5. But the one who's been more efficient is the one who made 5 out of 7 because he made, or she, of course, made a higher percentage of their shots. So they've made a better use of their resources. So businesses that if they need to reach levels of demand, they will prioritize productivity. If they're trying to kind of reduce waste and reduce waste, they maybe go for an efficiency approach. In 2.3, stock control just in time. I've gone through stock control. Just in time kind of follows from that. Procurement and logistics are the two key terms that students always forget. Procurement is all about sourcing the right suppliers. So that is the right suppliers with the right quantities, the right delivery times, the right quality, all of those things. Procurement is about finding those key suppliers so that you've got reliable supply so that you can make your products. Logistics is all about delivery and delivering on time to customers. And so just two key terms there that are worth double checking, but that's the gist of those two. And then once a business is producing their products, they've got different methods of checking the quality is appropriate. So quality control is where at the end of the product, they check the quality to check that it's the right level of quality. They might not necessarily do this for all the products, but they might. So for example, if you were manufacturing chocolate bars, maybe using flow production, you wouldn't check every single chocolate bar. You might check, I don't know, every 50th chocolate bar. And if there was a problem with that one, then you might have a look at the ones around it. But you're not going to check every single one. Quality assurance is where you check at every step of the process. So usually quality assurance is good if you're making something like a car because you can identify issues in the quality. You can identify faults earlier, which means you reduce waste. But it does mean you've got to train your staff to be able to find these faults. And it also means that production is probably going to take a little bit longer. I went to, a couple of weeks ago, I had to go and take my car to the garage because there was a nail in one of my tyres. And so the guy who repaired it said, as I was paying, he said, all right, well, I'll just do the QC while you're paying. And obviously business teacher alert goes off in my head and I'm thinking, okay, I wonder what their process is. And basically all their process was when he was putting the wheel back on, he put the nuts in to like secure the wheel. Naturally, you don't want the wheel falling off as you're driving away. But he didn't put the caps on the top, and I wondered why he didn't do that. And then while I was paying, I noticed that another guy went and checked that the wheel was on correctly, and then he put the caps on. And so it's just a simple way of making sure that it was all good before it was released out. Now, obviously, they'll do it for every product because if the wheel's not on correctly, you could crash and have a serious accident. So it's really important that they get that right. But not every business will do quality control every single time. Then in terms of 2.4 I've kind of gone through. I've just gone through 2.4 calculations earlier in the video, so I'm not going to go through those again. But 2.5, I think the main one is obviously there's lots of key terms there: formal, informal training, on the job, off the job training, induction training, those kind of things. But I think centralization and decentralization is one that students quite often get mixed up with. Centralization is where all the decisions are made at the center of the organization. So this typically looks like businesses being the same in every branch, whereas decentralization is where decision making is passed down to people lower down in the hierarchy. So in that situation, you might have branch managers making decisions. They might have different products on sale in different parts of the UK, for example. But I would recommend having a look at all those key terms, okay? And obviously, if you've got any questions about any particular ones, put them in the comments. Okay, let's do an exam technique recap. I've done this, obviously, in paper 1 video as well, but I will just recap it just so you know how to get these. I've switched up a little bit just to try and make it a little bit quicker. Knowledge, making accurate points, using key terms and concepts accurately. That's why those key terms are really important. Okay, that's one reason. The other is, like, if you read the question and you don't know what the key term is, you're going to be in a bit of trouble. Analysis, developing your points using links, cause, effect, consequences, because leads to, therefore. Application using the case study, that's specifically for sections B and C, and then evaluation, which is specifically for your 9 and 12 markers, is making a balanced argument and then reaching a judgment and conclusion. How do you get these marks? So we want to be in level 3 for each of these criteria. And so what I've done is I've put together this table. I usually do it for like different questions, but I figured with this one, because we've already done the papers, let's just remind you how to get these for the different skills, and then you can focus on the skills rather than like specific questions. So for knowledge and understanding, level 1, if you've got limited knowledge showing the points made, maybe your points aren't very accurate, maybe you've made sort of general assertions. Level 2, mostly accurate points made, maybe you haven't used the key terms as effectively. Level 3, accurate, strong knowledge shown in the points you've made, key terms used confidently. Application, limited use of the extract and case study quotes will be level 1. Good use of the case study, but inconsistent, so maybe not in every paragraph, or maybe you've used the same piece of application too many times in the same answer, would be level 2. And then level 3 is good use of the extract, relevant quotes used in every paragraph, including a conclusion for a 9 and 12 marker. You need different pieces of the case study used at different parts of your answer. So the different parts bit effectively means every paragraph. Analysis is going to be about your BLTs. Now, you make your point, then do your BLT. So if you only have isolated points and you maybe not provided very many links, you might get level 1. 2 to 4 links will be level 2, and 5 and above links will be level 3. So obviously for the 6, 9 and 12 markers, if you're doing 2 BLT paragraphs, you should have 3 in paragraph 1, 3 in paragraph 2, so that should get you to level 3. If you're not in level 3, it's because one of your links wasn't maybe strong enough or was repeated or wasn't an accurate link. For evaluation, level 1 is where you might not have a balance in your answers. This is obviously only the case for the 9 and 12 markers. You might have a conclusion that's ineffective. Level 2 would be balanced paragraphs and then a conclusion with some justification. And level 3 would be balanced paragraphs. In the 12 marker, you might, if in your conclusion suggested an alternative, and then you would have a conclusion with a justification in the 9 marker and 12 marker. So it depends on short-term, long-term impact, something like that. For the 9 markers for your conclusions, you could have a look at like maybe comparing them at that point. Okay, 2 types of 3-mark questions. There are 6 of these, all in section A. You've got why questions and how questions. Why questions, why is something good or bad? So explain one benefit to a business of being a private limited company. How questions are explaining how a business does something. So explain one way a business should extend their product lifecycle. So structure is your point and 2 links. And if you have a point and then a BLT, that gives you 3 links. So technically 1 more than you need. But again, as we said, if you can do it in time, it does mean that if you have any mistakes, you don't miss out on one of the links. You don't miss out one of the marks if one of your links isn't accurate. 6 markers. There's 2 types of 6-mark questions. Discuss questions and analyze questions. So the discuss questions assess knowledge and analysis, no case study. And the analyze questions assess analysis and application. So they do use a case study. So there's only one discuss question. It's at the end of section A. You'll know it's the one that doesn't have a case study because, well, it's in section A, so there's no case study. You will have to use your key terminology, make good points there. Whereas extract, section B and C both have extracts, but section C doesn't have 6 markers. That only has a 9 and 12 marker. So there's 2 analyze questions. They're both in section B. And then for your BLTs, you want one BLT, 2 BLTs. You don't have to do positive, negative. Sometimes it's great. Sometimes it works that way. You could do 2 negatives. You can do 2 positives. You just got to pay attention to what the question's asking for. If it's asking for 2 benefits, don't do a benefit and a drawback. Okay. If it's looking for 2 impacts, you could do 1 impact, 1 negative impact. So those are the 6 markers. 9 markers. There is 2 of these as well. 1 at the end of section B, 1 at the end of section C, or 1 in the middle of section C, sorry. You get a choice of 2 options. you have to look at analysis, application, and evaluation. Structure-wise, you are going to choose one of the options and do why you think that's the right option, why it's not the right option. For the why it's not the right option, you're talking about a disadvantage of the choice you've made. You're not talking about the other option. And then 3, the conclusion is you're justifying why your option is the right choice. In paragraph 3, that would be the only time you'd mention the other option. You might make a comparison to the other option at that point. So we need to have a balanced argument, which is why, for evaluation, we need a balanced argument, which is why we're doing for and against. If you just do for option 1, for option 2, you've not considered any negatives. So that's not evaluation. That's not a balanced argument. So if we look at this example, build a new factory in the UK, expand production at the existing Chinese factory. So if we go with option 1, we need to say why option 1 is the right option, why they should do the UK factory. Then we need to do some downsides to the UK factory. We're not talking about the other factory, the Chinese factory. But then in the conclusion, we might say, right, well, yeah, the UK factory might be cheaper, might be better quality, might be less defects, or whatever it is. At that point in your conclusion, you can compare. So all these questions will have a case study, so you must use the case study, and you must use quotes, including in your conclusion. Right, the 12 marker, there's one of these, it's the last question on the paper. Make sure you get there, because your timing is obviously really important. In terms of structure, it's not too much dissimilar to a 9 marker, really, in terms of the amount of paragraphs, but you obviously want to do a little bit more depth, especially in your conclusion. So these assess you on all 4 assessment objectives: knowledge, application, analysis, and evaluation. So you want to try and get your key terms in there. You would look at the positive, the negative, and then in your conclusion, is it positive or negative? You might suggest an alternative in your conclusion. So I've put it as a 4th bullet point. It's optional. You should only do it if you've got a really good answer. So evaluate whether crowdfunding is an effective source of finance for good and proper tea. You would say, yes, it is an effective source of finance. You talk about the benefits, the positives of crowdfunding. You talk about the negatives of crowdfunding in your negative section. And then in your conclusion, you would say, right, I think it's positive or negative, whichever. And then you can, at that point, suggest an alternative. So you could say, well, alternatively, they could use a bank loan. Alternatively, they could sell shares. Depends on what your belief is. So the alternative bit should only be done if you've got enough time and if you've got a good point. Don't do one if you haven't got a good point. So only usually students looking for a grade 8 or 9 should really attempt this. So what makes a good conclusion? Make your decision clear. Give the main reason for your decision. Remember, in the 9 marker, you might look at to compare them at that point and add an it depends on point. One tip for writing a good it depends on point could be to suggest a solution to the negative you've suggested. So if you've said the negative to, for example, the negative for a bank loan is that you'll have to pay it back with interest, your it depends on point could be, it depends on whether what you're spending the money on will generate enough money to cover the repayments and make some more money on top. So you could, your it depends on point fixes or kind of mitigates the negative that you suggested. On a 12 marker, you might also add that alternative into that conclusion. Right, dealing with the case studies. We've talked about this before in paper 1, but I think it's really, really important. My big piece of advice, you've got 2 case studies, one for section B, one for section C. You should find the case studies to be quite accessible. You're more likely to have heard of the business. So every question in B and C will require application. It's a good idea, in my opinion, to read the essay questions before reading the case study. And then when you're reading the case study, annotate the sentences you could use for each question. And if you can, use different colours for different questions to make it easier when you look back to find the right parts in the case study. So here, for example, I've got this example. I think this is the one I used in the paper 1 video as well. And what you'll see here is that I've highlighted specific parts of the case study in different colours to make it clear for me which bits relate to which question. Now, you could do that with the short answer questions as well. I don't think it's necessarily as important to do with that. I think I would just be doing it for the 6, 9, and 12 markers. But that'll really help with your case study use. Highlighting a case study with the same colour and not making any annotations is, to be honest, it's as useless as just reading the case study blank. So I would strongly recommend using highlighters or using a different coloured pen or using one of those fantastic Bic pens that have 4 different colours. That's the best way of doing it. Final tips. Maximise your marks in section A. Try and go quicker than 1 mark a minute on the short answer questions. Make sure you've got the right amount of links in your 3 markers. Section B and C, use the case study. Make sure you don't go over time on the long answer questions. And your 6 markers don't need to be positive negative, but your 9 and 12 markers do need that balance. If you do those things right, I'm sure you'll be absolutely fine. That's it for this video. If you've got any questions, put them in the comments. Good luck. Thanks for watching. I hope you get the grade that you deserve in the summer. If you do business at A-level, then I'll see you next year, because there's a whole range of A-level Edexcel videos and resources for you. See you in a bit.